Welcome back to Lecture 7 of ZOO3649 Evolutionary Genetics 2020. And yes, in the last lecture, we talked about natural selection, and one of the big main ideas, like a bomb, bang, it burst in biology. And suddenly, so much made sense. So much which didn't make sense in the days of ignorance suddenly made sense now that evolution by natural selection was here. This man changed our lives. Whether you like it or not, whether you agree with it or it doesn't really matter what you or me personally think is irrelevant. The fact is reality is reality. Whether we believe or want to or not, evolution happened and it's a fact. So we are all here because of that. We've all asked, what is the meaning of life? We all want to know these things. We all want to know what is our contribution to the meaning of life. Where do we fit in? What is our purpose? Darwin answered that question for all of us forever. Okay? There's no other answer to that question. So I want to just quickly, in this lecture, talk to you about this man that changed all our lives. Basically, one of the fathers of biology. And you're all studying biology. I studied biology. So let us talk about this man that changed all our lives. What I want to emphasize, however, is that this man was an average guy like you and me. He dropped out of medical school. Nah? After only 2 years, he dropped out. Now I know a lot of you are sitting here thinking, Aish, I also applied to medical school, they didn't take me. So you are also in the same boat as Darwin. So there's hope for you, don't worry. If medicine didn't want you, it's only because they didn't appreciate your mind. You have a biological mind. You will have many, many interesting things on your mind after 3649 that medical students can only dream about. Okay? So don't worry if you didn't get into medical school. Darwin even dropped out of medical school, and he is one of the fathers of biology. So don't worry. Yeah? He was a failure in medicine. So, that comes to the question, right, that everybody's asking. How did this guy who failed, he was a failure at medicine, how did he figure out the meaning of life? Why couldn't a clever guy have figured it out? Well, Darwin failed medicine, that's for sure. But that doesn't mean he wasn't clever. You have to understand, in those days, medicine was not the way it is now. Sophisticated, using biology, already starting to use evolutionary theory. Look at COVID, how it's evolving. If we don't understand evolution, COVID is going to take over. The only thing that's stopping COVID is evolution and understanding it. Same with AIDS, same with all our diseases. So in those days, medicine was about memorization. Okay? It was not about using this too much. So just because Darwin failed at medicine doesn't mean he wasn't clever. Okay? So let's look at his story. And one thing you have to take away from his story, and then I'm going to repeat it a few times, that is, he was able to observe. He was able to look and see. Not like you or me. We look at something and we don't even register sometimes what we're seeing. We don't see differences. We don't see similarities. A tree is just a tree for you and me. But not for Darwin. Darwin was able to observe and see these observations and note how perfectly suited everything was to its environment. Okay? He was able to observe. So, when he was at Cambridge, he got influenced by a professor of botany named Henslow. And this Professor Henslow recommended him to a captain of a ship. It was a Royal British Navy ship. And the Royal Geographic Society of the United Kingdom had determined that they want to send a ship to South America to map the coast of South America. Can you imagine that? In those days, we didn't know what the map of South America looked like. Can you imagine? Imagine there was no Google Maps where you can go and zoom into South America and you see the shape. It was unknown. It was a map with a blank space. Unknown, terrifying even. You didn't know if you went to the edge, you would fall off the world. Terrible, terrible, superstitious times. And they decided, no, we're going to send a ship there and we're going to map out South America. Very long task, very dangerous task. And they thought, well, while we are going to send this ship, we're going to send this captain. Why don't, because maybe on that side, there are living animals, trees, plants, things which we don't have here. Maybe we could at least document what they have on that side. So let's send a biology guy. Let's send a guy who is good in biology. So this Professor Henslow said to Captain Fitzroy, I know a guy, a young boy. Okay, he failed at medicine, but he is very good at observation. He makes a lot of notes. He draws beautiful pictures. Remember, there was no photographs in those days. Huh? You have to collect the specimen, you have to draw it perfectly. Huh? These are all the qualities that the young Darwin had. So Captain Fitzroy decided, okay, we can't pay him. And remember, the professors did not want to go. Why? Because it was going to take a long time. They took from 1831, 5 years on a ship living. Only a young one could manage to, wanted to go. And so he was taken, Darwin, young man, was taken on this trip around the world. Okay? On the ship, and the ship was called His Majesty's ship, HMS Beagle. Okay? So it was called the HMS Beagle. And Beagle, as most of you know, is a breed of dog. Okay? It's an English breed of dog. It's a beagle. It's a long-eared dog. So this ship was called the HMS Beagle. So the voyage of the HMS Beagle took it to some incredible places. And it changed the world as we know it. Not only did it map the coast of South America, which was not known. In that way, it changed the world. But much more importantly, it changed the world. Because on board was a young man who was observing and collecting and drawing everything that he came across alive. That one was Darwin. And because of that man on board that ship and doing that voyage, he was able to come with this theory of natural selection. Okay? So this ship, as you see here, is the southern coast of South America. It basically sailed all the way from England, and as you get far south here, you get to the Falkland Islands. You get to, and the Falkland Islands was claimed by England, and to this very day it is territory of England. It belongs to England. So on this voyage, England also claimed a whole bunch of territory, other people's territory. What Darwin figured out, in these bays, there are huge mountains. You know, you can have the sea meeting a mountain of ice right at the beach. No? Incredible landscapes. They went all the way around the globe. They started in England, went down to South America, and they mapped this coast of South America perfectly. They had some big troubles here. You see where my mouse is here? Coming around the southern. This part here, if you think our Cape storms are very terrible, you can be sure that the storms around the Cape of South America is even worse, because look how much further south this Cape of South America is compared to our Cape of South Africa. It's much further south, much colder, and the seas are rough. Once they managed to get around, it was not easy. They mapped this western coast. They got to the Galapagos Islands, and that is one of the places where Darwin really made his big discoveries. And then sailed west far enough and came out at New Zealand, Australia, across the Indian Ocean, past Mauritius, Madagascar. They stopped at Cape Town. Imagine Darwin has been to South Africa. And they went back to England. So they went around the world. Okay? And everywhere, Darwin was collecting, observing. Here is the southern part of South America. It is absolutely full of millions of thousands of little islands, as you see here. So this way to go around this, you are exposing yourself to a huge storms. You see the red here is what the Beagle was doing. On one time, it was in a place, it got blown out to sea during a violent storm and was only luckily able to recover again in the shelter of these islands. Some years before that, a Portuguese man named Magellan figured out, actually, I don't need to go around here and expose myself to all the horrible bad weather that is here. I can go into this inlet here, and it's perfectly calm in these inlets because there's no storms in there. The mountains are high and it's protecting you, and I can navigate my way painfully and slowly all the way out. That passage is what became known as the Straits of Magellan, and they are the way, the easy way, the safe way to go around the southern tip of South America. The HMS Beagle could not take that route, even though they knew that route. Why? Because they wanted to map the coast of South America. They could not take the one that goes through like this. They had to come around. They had to map all these islands. They have to map all these islands here. Okay? That's why they had to go around, taking the dangerous route around Cape Horn. And this picture here is a picture of the Straits of Magellan. This area here, that is inside this area. You see the high mountains, very sheltered. Okay, so the Voyage was most famous for its zoological discoveries. Darwin discovered the Falkland Island fox, the iguanas of the Galapagos Islands, owls, in fact, hundreds of different species. When they arrived in the Galapagos archipelago, they found a number of islands that were close to each other, but nevertheless they were islands. Okay? And what did he discover? He discovered something strange in these islands. Each one of them had its own tortoise. Each one of it had its own iguana. Each one had its own birds. All of these iguanas and the birds and the tortoises, they seemed to be quite closely related to each other. But they were all different. The ones on the different islands were different looking to each other. And yet they were closely related. Why? Why? Why were they clearly related to mainland birds? But why were they, every island has a different type? Look at this, for example. Look at the face of this bird here and the eye. It's the same bird. It just has, each one has a different beak. You see that? He has a sharp beak. He has a fat but small beak. He has a huge beak. And yet you can see these 4 bird species, they must have had a common ancestor. They are all so close to the one that lives on the mainland. But this one lives on one of the Galapagos Islands. This one lives on another Galapagos Island. This one lives on another, and yet the 4th one on yet another island. So these Galapagos Islands were strange. They had very closely related, but different. Each island had a different. And that is the power of observation. Darwin observed this and he was scratching his head, thinking, why? Why is it like that? And my friends, I let you into a secret on how to be a scientist. If you have never asked the question why about something natural, it might be too late now in 3rd year to suddenly be curious about why things are the way they are. But I can tell you, that young man on that ship, he was very curious. He was like one of those annoying, curious children. You know, the one that always asks mom and dad while they're driving on a long trip, Mom, but why is it like that? But why is it like that? But why? That's the one who becomes a scientist. Are you such a kid? Maybe. If you are, we will see you at honors time. Okay, but for now, Darwin was such a young man. And he was scratching his head, trying to figure out what's going on here. It's the same bird. The beak is different on each different island. We'll get back to his finches in the next lectures. But remember these, okay? This is why I say, my goodness, if you are watching one video, missing 5, watching another one, you think you're prepared for this module. You're not, okay? You have to watch all the videos. Now here's a picture of that same man years later. An old man. He developed the theory of natural selection when he came to England. He was not old like this, he was still young. When the ship came back to England, he had his mind was full of stuff. He collected so many things. He drew so many pictures. And then he sat down at home and he tried to figure this out. No? When he returned home to England. By 1838, 2 years after the ship came back, the Beagle had arrived back home, he started chatting to his close friends Huxley and Charles Lyell. Remember, Lyell was a geologist. Lyell was one of the guys who figured out that with very small changes from day to day, you can have a mountain or you can have a canyon. Lyell was the guy who figured out that things take a long time in the world, in the natural, in the world as we see it. The earth is old. He was friends with Darwin. They were drinking in the same bar, in the same shebeen in Cambridge. So while they were drinking a quart together, Lyell was saying to Darwin, hey Shmar, maybe the things are most suited. If you are right and you have to have a struggle, and then the most suited survive and the least suited die, then it will take a long time for your theory to work. When at the end, after many generations, you see a different evolution, a different species evolving. So evolution, Darwin's idea, takes time. It needs time. Can't be done in a couple of days, couple of months or years. It needs generation upon generation upon generation. Right? So he was talking to all his friends and he came up with this idea. He said, if the earth is old, then it gives enough time for natural selection to have worked to create all this variation and to work on all this variation. Yeah? But one thing Darwin, unlike Huxley and unlike Lyle, Darwin was a very human kind of guy. He had fear. He was afraid. And what was he afraid of in 1838? Things we are not afraid of now. Nobody cares about these things now. Or some people do. Most people don't need to. But in those days, what was very strong? The church. The Church of England was so strong. Now, English people don't give two hoots about the church. But back then, it was very strong. And this theory of Darwin's was not going to be appreciated by the church, right? You know why. He's saying there's no creation. Nature has created itself through evolution, through my idea. He knew this was going to create shockwaves. He knew that because most of the world was still supernatural in their beliefs. Darwin knew that he was going to be into trouble, and he was afraid. And so he didn't want to publish his book. He wrote the book about natural selection, but it was sitting on his bookshelf. He kept it to itself for 20 years. Only his friends knew, and his wife. For 20 years, he kept it, and he was so terrified. Imagine for 20 years, you got this idea which you think is going to change the world. The world would never be the same again. But you're so afraid, because what will those people think of you? They will ridicule you. They will try to discredit you. He was so afraid, as a typical Englishman, always concerned about what other people think of him. But finally he published. Why? Because of this guy here, Alfred Russel Wallace. Now Wallace was a bit younger than Darwin, but he's also British and also a biologist and also very, very good at observing. If you're no good at observing, you're not going to be a good scientist. He also worked in South America, but he also worked in Southeast Asia. Okay? Southeast Asia, especially parts of Indonesia, I don't have a map to put up for you, but is also, like Galapagos, made up of thousands of little islands. And what did Wallace see? Every island has its own kind of animal. All of them appear to be closely related, but each island has its own kind. Why, he was asking himself. He was saying, in Indonesia, on one side of these islands, we have animals that look like animals from Asia. But on the other side of this line, which we now call today Wallace's line, the animals look like they're coming from Australia. So how did these two kinds of animals arrive there? Wallace came up with the same theory, that there has to be variation, there has to be a struggle, there has to be differential survival and reproduction. There has to be those things. He came up with this theory independently of Darwin, because both of them had very similar experiences and both of them were clever, but most importantly, they were able to observe and ask, why is it like this? No? So Huxley was the one who came to Charles Darwin. Remember, Huxley was one of his shebeen guys. Found him in the shebeen drinking, and he said to him, Darwin, we're in trouble. This guy, another guy, I've seen a speech of his. He came up with your idea. He's going to publish it. So Charles, please get your stuff off the bookshelf and take it to the publisher immediately. Otherwise, this guy Wallace is going to take the fame away from you. So that is what eventually prompted Darwin to finally take his book off the shelf. And in 1859, 20 years after it was written, it was finally published. And the book was called The Origin of Species, by means of natural selection. And it is one of it. I've read it many times myself, and I can tell you now, if you look for a copy on the internet, there are many free copies. Read it for yourself. It's not written in a clever way with big language. Darwin was a simple guy. Read the book, if you dare. The book was one of the most famous books that was ever published. And more than any other book, it has changed the world. Everything that you benefit from in medicine, in populations, in biology, is thanks to Mr. Darwin and his theory. Okay? So evolution has no goal. Edwin Paley would say it has a goal. I want to create a watch. I want to create a human. I will evolve it. I will make it happen by evolving towards a goal. No. That is the wrong way to think about evolution. Evolution is blind. It goes wherever direction it wants to go. It does not have a goal. There is no end game for evolution. Okay? You have to understand this, guys. There is no march towards an ideal species at the top. That's what we keep thinking. We are the pinnacle. Humans are the pinnacle of evolution, the most evolved, most advanced, most... Then, if I put you under some water for 1 minute, how long do you think you're going to last? Are you going to have kids after that? You'll be dead. Okay. So we're not ideally the best evolved for living in water, are we? No. So this ideal, the goal, it's meaningless. Okay? Everything is context dependent. So we might be great, we are intelligent, we make computers, we fly aeroplanes, but you put me underwater for 1 minute and I'm dead. But what about a fish? Fish cannot fly aeroplanes. Fish cannot do medicine. But I put the fish under the water, it'll survive the whole life. So which one is more evolved? It depends what the environment is. Okay? So there's no goal. There's no such thing as a most highly evolved species. Humans and insects, and the bacteria, we all have the same amount of evolution because we all come from a common ancestor. Okay? So if you've ever heard someone say, if we evolved from apes, how come there are still apes? By now, every one of you should be laughing their heads off when you hear someone say that. It's a joke, okay? Because humans are not coming from present day chimpanzees, are we? No. Evolution means that humans and present day chimpanzees had a common ancestor, okay? And chimpanzees evolved into chimpanzees from that ancestor, and humans evolved into humans from that common ancestor. That is why we had still apes. Okay? So, William Paley's watchmaker doesn't have a goal. A watchmaker has a goal. He wants to make a watch. Evolution doesn't want to make an eye or a nose. Evolution doesn't want to do that. There's no goal that says you must make an eye or a nose or a foot. Evolution has no goal. What we see is just what we get from a random wandering of evolution through many different lines of descent. Okay, I'll leave it there. I hope you enjoyed our lecture about Mr. Darwin and his younger days and what made him answer eventually the question of questions. What is the meaning of life? And so I will hope we will unpack natural selection a bit more in the next 2 lectures. We'll talk about fitness in lecture 8. Join me for that.